Welcome to week 9 of the journey. This week we're talking about the Judges. And the Judges were quite simply a time of chaos. Now listen to this. In Judges chapter 17 verse 6, it simply makes this note. In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. In other words, it was a free-for-all. This was a description of the time in which they lived. I remember several years ago when I entered ministry that one of the pastors of the largest church in the community that I was pastoring invited me to lunch. And I was excited to go. We met at one of our local restaurants and we sat down and he got right to it. He said, Ryan, there's 3 things that you need to embrace in ministry if you're going to survive. And he's the big church pastor in our community, so my ears perked up. My engagement was tuned in to what he was about to say. And he said, the first thing that you've got to embrace is that life's not fair. Life's not fair. You're going to be amazed at some of the difficulties that you face in life. And you've got to embrace that. Okay. Ryan, you really have to embrace that, he said. Because you're going to discover that there are times and places, events and circumstances where you will be the victim of life not being fair. And you've got to embrace that if you're going to survive ministry. His name was Kent. I said, okay, Kent. He said, you really got to embrace it. Okay. I was looking forward at this point to Numbers 2 and 3 because the first one didn't sound all that good. And he looked across the table and he said, the second thing that you're going to have to embrace if you're going to survive ministry is that people are crazy. That people are crazy. That people will do things that simply make you stop in disbelief. People will do things to you, with you, toward you, against you, that will just make you think, what's going on here? People are crazy, he said. He said, you're really going to have to embrace that. Because people will hurt you. People will stand against you. People will oppose you. People will laugh with you. People will cry with you. Both good and bad. People are crazy. I don't know if you've ever defined yourself that way, but he was kind of defining all of us that way, that people are crazy. And so, for him, if I were going to survive in ministry, I needed to embrace the reality that there are times that life's not fair and that people are crazy. I remember thinking across the table, I hope number 3 gets better than the first 2. God, what were you thinking when you called me? And then he said this, Ryan, no matter how unfair life is, no matter how crazy people are, love must always be the bottom line. Love must always be the bottom line. God demonstrates this in the book of Judges. You see, this was a time of chaos. This was a time in which life was unfair. This was a time where people just were crazy. This was a time where the text says that everyone just did what they saw fit. That's it. Anything goes. Chaos was the result of this period of time. I wonder if the time in which we live today is not too far removed from the time of the judges. Anything goes. No absolute truth. Moral relativism. A desire for tolerance, and yet tolerance is inconsistent because you literally can't be tolerant of everything. Because you would be intolerant of those who are intolerant. It falls in on itself. But this day and age that we live in is a day where chaos is celebrated as good, right, and normal. That individual choice, that individualistic attitudes, that this is the proper attitudes of the day in which we live. So when I look at the world in which we live, it doesn't seem all that far removed from Judges, where it says everyone did as he saw fit. That could be described of us today. This is a day in which life's unfair and people are crazy, but love must always be the bottom line. It's the equalizer, if you will. I love it. In Judges chapter 2, we're given a description of the cycle of the judges. The book of Judges is a book in which the people of Israel experience the same thing over and over again. It's a time in which they rebelled against God, that God handed them into the hands of the enemies, and they would beat them down, they would battle them, they would be victorious over them, and they would enslave them. That was kind of the time. Then the people of Israel, as they were battered, as they were beaten, that they would cry out to the Lord. And when they would, God would deliver them. And so, throughout the Judges, what we see is that God's bottom line is love. That God's bottom line is compassion. Allow me just to read a little bit of Judges chapter 2. I'd like to start in verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, that was the generation that we talked about last week in Joshua, this generation that had experienced the conquest, that had experienced God's victory, that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers. In other words, that generation died. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And so this is a generation that didn't know their history. This is a generation that didn't know that God had led them through the Red Sea. This is a generation that did not know that they had crossed over the Jordan River on dry ground. This was a generation that maybe didn't know about the Battle of Jericho. This was a generation that did not know the Lord nor what he had done. So they didn't know the law. They didn't know God's holiness. They didn't know about the Day of Atonement that we talked about in Leviticus. They didn't know. This was a generation who simply was devoid of knowing the person and the character of God. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and Ashtoreths. This was a generation that didn't know. And when we remove knowledge of God, rebellion results. Not only does rebellion result, but the worship of other gods or the pursuit of things that are ungodly, that's the result. The pursuit of pleasure would be a way to say that in the day in which we live today, that pleasure trumps all else. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. And they were in great distress. And so here, God handed them over for the choices that they were making. That they were choosing to rebel against God, and God handed them over. God gave them that which they desired. This is what Paul said in Romans when he said that God gave them over to do things that ought not to be done. That God has handed them over to their enemies, and their enemies beat them down. And then the text says they were in great distress. They cried out to the Lord. They cried out to the Lord. You know, when we get beaten down, it is appropriate to cry out to the Lord. When we are depressed and distressed, it is appropriate to cry out to the Lord. When life's been unfair and people have been crazy, it's appropriate to cry out to the Lord. Verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they gave themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with that judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. In other words, the Lord delivered them. And listen to the language of his deliverance. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. And so here you have a people who rebelled, who are beaten down, who are distressed, and God has compassion on them. You see, when life's unfair and people are crazy, God has compassion. Love is God's bottom line. Man, that's the story of the judges. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to experience the cycle that they went in. I don't want to rebel against the Lord. Man, I don't want to get beaten up by the people around me. I don't want to experience distress. I trust you don't either. But know this, there are times in our life where it's unfair. There are times in our life where people are crazy. There are times in our life where we're discouraged, depressed, all those sorts of things. Cry out to the Lord, because he is a God who has compassion. He is a God whose bottom line is love. Now, the day and age we live in is described in Matthew 24. It says that as the increase of wickedness happens, the love of most will grow cold. The love of most will grow cold. I just want to encourage us this week to pray against the wickedness of the world in which we live and to intensify our love for one another and for the world in which we live. That it may be described of us that no matter how unfair life is and no matter how crazy people are, that when it comes to Christ and his church, that love is the bottom line. May that be the way people talk about us as Christians, as followers of Jesus, as here at Faith Alliance Church. God bless you. I'm praying for you. I'm praying that God would use his word to stir in our hearts everything that he wants us to be and to become. And remember, Love must always be the bottom line. Have a great week.